Hello and welcome to our weekly Bible reading video. Today we're beginning a new book, a book from the New Testament that really is one of the most central theological books of the entire Bible, and that is Paul's letter to the Romans. This is such an important book for our faith tradition, our Wesleyan faith tradition, in that we know from history that John Wesley had a very impactful change of heart one night. The night at Aldersgate, in which he said that his heart was strangely warmed. And it happened because he was listening not to the book of Romans itself, but he was listening to someone read Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans. So this is such a powerful book that even just reading about it changed John Wesley's life and in effect changed the course of our history that we're still living out today in the Wesleyan tradition. Why is this book so powerful? It's because it probably is the clearest expression of Paul's theology in all of the Bible. This is a letter that is not written situationally like so many of his other letters. Rome was a place where Paul had not yet been when he wrote this letter. We do know that Paul eventually makes it to Rome. He makes it as a prisoner there, and his life will end in Rome. He will be martyred sometime in either the late 60s or very early 70s, at the same time that the Jewish revolt is going on in the Holy Land. There is a crackdown by the Roman government against the Jewish people, and that includes the Christians because it was very much a Jewish movement still at that point, and Paul will be beheaded while he is in Rome. However, this comes before he makes it to Rome. This is a letter that he's writing expressing how much he wants to go see the Romans. He wants to go and hear about their faith and see their faith firsthand instead of just having reports of them come to him. And that is different than his other letters, where most of his other letters are addressed to churches that he had been intimately involved with, either helping to establish those churches on his missionary journeys, or he had still a relationship with them in one way or another. And when he's writing to those other churches, he oftentimes is responding to maybe a letter they sent him or a report that he got back from one of his co-missionaries. And he was addressing specific situations that were happening in those communities. And they are more of a pastoral letter in which he is acting as a spiritual guide and a pastor for this community, helping them navigate difficult situations. But Romans is really an introductory letter of who Paul is and what his belief system is. This is not a systematic theology in the way that we would think of that today, where you take all of the main doctrines of the faith and you explain them and build on them until you get through all of the major tenets of the faith. But it is as close to a systematic theology as we get in the New Testament. Now, the book of Romans parallels the book of Hebrews. Tradition had said that Paul wrote Hebrews as well, although scholars aren't quite as sure of that anymore. There is definitely some Pauline language in the book of Hebrews, but it is different in some significant ways, even in the fact that Paul does not address personally his audience, where in all of his other letters, including here in Romans, he introduces himself at the very beginning that this is from Paul or from Paul and certain associates of his. That doesn't happen in the book of Hebrews, but there may be some reasons for that we will talk about when we read the book of Hebrews. In fact, we're probably going to look at Hebrews after we look at Romans, and we'll explore that a little bit more. But whereas the book of Hebrews is directly written to a Jewish Christian audience and really builds a theology off of their Jewish identity, Paul is writing mostly to a Gentile audience in Rome. And so he's going to build the theology a little differently than the writer of Hebrews builds that theology. And he is going to come at it from more of a philosophical angle that the Roman Gentile Christians would have been familiar with. Now, this is not to say that he doesn't use the Old Testament, because we see in our readings for this week that he uses several Old Testament quotes and passages to build his arguments, but he does so in a very logical sense, in a sense not so much as Jesus fulfills these passages and prophecies, but how there is a logical thread that builds throughout the Old Testament that eventually leads to Jesus. It's more of a sense of logic than revelation. And so we get a very Gentile-centered use of the Old Testament to prove that Jesus is the logical conclusion for all that the Old Testament has written about. You will also see throughout the book of Romans that Paul addresses the Jewish people and their place within the covenant community of faith. God has not discarded the Jewish people, and the Jewish identity of the early church is still very important, and it's important for these Gentile Christians to identify. But also Paul is going to address the big controversy of the day, which he had dealt with in other churches, and we see that already popping up in these first few chapters. And that is that the Roman church, most likely, had already been approached by Jewish Christian believers who were telling them that they had to become fully Jewish, including the practice of circumcision, in order to become fully Christian. That to be fully Christian, you had to be fully Jewish as well. And so Paul talks about, in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, the value of circumcision and whether or not it is necessary to be a Christian believer. And he talks about how circumcision without following God means nothing, and yet following God without circumcision is just as valid as any other expression of faith. So Paul is trying to battle that influence of Jewish Christians who were spreading what really became the first heresy in the church, while also preserving the importance of the Jewish identity of the church. And we'll get that as we get into chapters 9, 10, and 11. We'll see that more, where Paul argues for the importance of God's promises to the Jewish people, even as the church becomes more and more Gentile. Do keep in mind as you read in the book of Romans that Paul's language and his structure of the book can sometimes get very detailed. It's very tempting to get lost in the weeds. He is very precise about his language, and his arguments can become very technical theologically. And Paul has a tendency anyway in his writings to write sentences that really never end, that are paragraphs long. And so don't get intimidated by all of that. Try to keep the big picture of what Paul is talking about. And if you want the big picture, he really gives a synopsis of what he's going to be talking about in the first 6 verses of chapter 1. And he gives a mini overview of what his theology is. And this theology that he's going to explain in more depth is given in short form in those 6 verses. So if you want to go and really concentrate on those 6 verses to give you an understanding of what you're going to read in the next 16 chapters. But also, if you want to look at chapter 1, verse 16, this also gives a very clear message as to Paul's intention for the letter. He says this. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." That is also a good synopsis of what he's talking about. And he's basically saying, I'm not ashamed of what I believe in and what I preach. And now I'm going to tell you about what all of that is. There are 3 points that I want to highlight here as we look at the first 4 chapters of Romans. The first being that Paul introduces a concept here that is later developed by theologians throughout the centuries, and it is called natural theology. Natural theology discusses how humankind really has examples of God in the natural world that can teach us about God's presence, God's nature, the truth of God's love, even if we do not have the special revelation of Jesus Christ or the special revelation of the law of Moses and the history of Israel. Natural law says that we can observe the natural world, from the changing weather and seasons to the beauty of mountains and forests, to the way that animal life works, that all of those things give us examples of a creator who has purpose and design for his creation, a creator who cares for his creation. All these things point us toward God. And unfortunately, we as Protestants have not developed this idea of natural revelation or natural theology in the same way that our Catholic brothers and sisters have. But the idea is that from the very beginning of life, we are given evidence of God in the world around us, and that every person has an opportunity to know God, even if they do not know the specifics of this theology that Paul is describing. He also mentions that we inside of us have a moral law that is an example of the natural law of God or natural theology. That because all of us have a sense of right and wrong, that there are things that universally are seen as evil and things that are universally seen as good, that those things point to God as well. The trouble, Paul says, is that we use those examples to worship the creation instead of the Creator. That we use those natural examples, that natural evidence for God, to turn to idolatry. And we created idols out of the form of nature. And so that we have used this natural revelation of God to increase our sinfulness, or as a door towards sinfulness. And so that's an issue. And that is one of the reasons then why Jesus Christ has appeared to correct the misjudgment of humankind in looking at the natural world, and instead of seeing God, see an opportunity for idolatry. So here are two examples that Paul gives from the first two chapters of Romans, where he talks about this natural law. First of all, he says in chapter 2, when Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts. Right there, he's talking about the natural moral law of humanity is evidence that God is present with us, even if we do not understand God's revelation fully. And the danger in that he describes at the end of chapter 1 in verse 25, where he says, and this is a statement that can be true of all humanity, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So here are two examples, one positive and one negative, of natural theology and how it affects humankind and human society throughout the ages. The second point flows naturally from this, and that is that Paul talks about, while yes, every human being, whether they are Jew or Gentile, has a reason to understand God even a little, that humans have not taken that understanding and produced faith out of it, but instead every human being has transgressed God's law and is responsible for sin. And in these first few chapters, we get a little bit of what might seem like a pessimistic view of Paul's theology, but he's really just building the first stage of it, and we won't see the next stages until our readings in further weeks. But what he is saying here is that because everyone has the natural law of God within them, that everyone has fallen short of God's purposes that are expressed in God's law. Now, for the Jews who have the law, they understand their sin. But for the Gentiles who did not have the written law, they may not understand their sin as sin. But Paul is very clear here that every single person has participated in the sinful nature and expression of that nature in humankind. And so every person is responsible before God for participating in evil. And so we get this verse that we are probably all very familiar with from chapter 3, verse 23, where Paul says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now that is the point that he's trying to build here in these first few chapters. And it's important for us all then to recognize our sinfulness so that we can receive the healing and the forgiveness of God through Jesus Christ. And so it's very important that we don't just stop at verse 23, because Paul doesn't stop his theology with this pessimistic view of humankind. But let's look at what verse 24 says. Paul says, "But they are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." And so that is very important. Don't just leave off the grace half of things. Sometimes people use these first few chapters of Romans as a weapon against others to really point out their sin and to make a big deal about other people's sin. Whereas Paul is very intentional about talking about not pointing out other people's sins without looking at your own. And we should not be so focused on sin that we miss the message of redemption that comes in Jesus Christ. When we get to chapter 8, we're going to see the most beautiful expression of the redemption of Jesus Christ that is in the entire Bible. And Paul gives us the deepest explanation of what God has done for those people who have participated in sin. So how do we access the benefits of this redemption of Jesus Christ and move from our sin to this place of forgiveness and healing and wholeness? How do we escape the conviction of the natural law that convicts all of us and shows all of us our sins? Well, here Paul is going to use a prime example from the history of Israel to introduce the concept that leads us from pessimism to optimism, that leads us from sin to redemption. And that is the person of Abraham, who has this great characteristic, this great aspect of his nature called faith. Faith is what brings us to the place of redemption. Now that faith, of course, is conditioned on the work that Jesus Christ has already done for us. But faith is what is going to make the difference in whether we can move into this place of being claimed as a son or a daughter of God and finding our freedom from sin. And Abraham, Paul is very intentional about writing here, demonstrated his faith before he ever demonstrated a sign of his religious identity. And he uses circumcision here as, again, that identifying mark of the Jewish people, of the Jewish religion. And he makes a point to say that Abraham exercised his faith long before Abraham submitted to the sign of circumcision. So faith is primary. Faith is the aspect of Abraham's life that brought him to a place of righteousness. And he talks about how Abraham's faith was credited as righteousness, not Abraham's following of circumcision, of following of the rules of his religion. Obviously, the law, the written law, did not exist yet for Abraham, as it would not come for hundreds of years later when Moses was given that law. And so Paul is trying to do two things here. He's trying to, number one, identify that if we all have access to that natural law, the natural theology, then we all have access to this thing called faith, because it came before the special revelation of God and the people of Israel. And so anyone, even the Gentiles, can access this redemption because they can exercise faith in the same way that Abraham did. However, Paul is also keeping his gospel grounded in the truth of God's revelation to the Jewish people. He's still keeping those Jewish roots of the faith. That, yes, faith could be exercised by anyone, but it was exercised by this father of the Jewish faith. And so our Jewish roots are still very important. If anything, the Jewish people didn't teach us just about the law of God, but they taught us how to be people of faith, and faith is what matters. So what is faith? Well, we don't get a clear understanding or definition of faith right here in these pages of Paul's writings. But what Paul is talking about here is that Abraham trusted God. And I think that word trust is the most important word in defining faith. that when you put your trust in God, you are demonstrating and exercising faith. When God tells you something and you trust that He will do what He has said, that is an act of faith. Trusting God, even if you want to go back to natural theology, trusting God for the very air we breathe, for the seasons which produce crops and help us to live. That's a way that Gentiles can understand faith as well. Trusting God to bring about those natural ways in which our life is preserved and our life is made abundant. And so what Paul is asking all of us to do is to trust in God. Trust that God's promises for you are true and they will come to fruition. Trust every day when you wake up that God is going to give you the power to live a life of victory over sin and a life in which you can discover God's purpose for you. Trust that God is going to care for you not only in this life but throughout eternity. If you can have that trust, then you will exercise the faith of Abraham and you will move from the conviction of sin to the freedom of Christ's redemption. That's a lot of theology packed into 23, 24 minutes, but I hope that it helps you understand the basic tenets of this theology that Paul is bringing forth. I hope it gives you a good introduction to the book of Romans, and that the rest of your reading will be very fruitful in this book, that you will discover the faith that comes in trusting Jesus Christ, and it will make your heart strangely warmed in the same way that it did for John Wesley. We won't have a video next week because next week is Christmas, but we will come back the next week with another video explaining what Paul is writing here in the book of Romans. So enjoy reading the book of Romans, and I'll see you very soon. And Merry Christmas.